Now this is crazy. Why was the Book of Enoch removed from the Bible? There's some sort of a lesson in the myth, some sort of allegory. There's things about these stories that probably have hints of truth.
But the Book of Enoch is very complex. First Enoch, there are 3 different books of Enoch. Why is this important? Because some of the most extraordinary, astounding, Christological prophecy are in the parables in First Enoch.
There is a verse in the Book of Enoch that no one argued about for 2,000 years. Not because scholars agreed on what it meant, because no one could read the original word clearly enough to argue. The manuscript fragment was damaged at exactly the right point, or exactly the wrong one, depending on how you look at it. The critical term sat beneath a layer of oxidation and ink bleed that made every prior translation a guess, dressed up as a certainty. Then an AI read it. The system was trained on thousands of ancient Aramaic documents, the kind of work that would take a human paleographer, someone who spends their career decoding ancient handwriting, the better part of a decade. The machine did it in less time than it takes to run a full diagnostic. And when it returned its translation of that damaged verse from the Book of Enoch's Aramaic fragments, the ones pulled from the caves above the Dead Sea, the researchers in the room went quiet because the word it identified wasn't vague, it wasn't poetic, it wasn't open to the kind of interpretation that scholars have been comfortable with for centuries. It was specific. It named a unit of time, a calculable period, a number that, when researchers ran the arithmetic implied by the surrounding text, resolved to something that did not feel abstract at all. It felt recent. This is the story of what that verse says, what the Watchers are, and why a mistranslated word may have been hiding something in plain sight for 2,000 years. Most people encounter the Book of Enoch as a footnote, a curiosity. Yet the kind of thing mentioned in a Bible study and then quickly moved past. It didn't make the cut for the canonical Bible, at least not for most Christian and Jewish traditions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the exception. They've considered it scripture for 1,500 years. Everyone else decided it was too strange, too cosmological, too unruly. That decision was made in the 4th century by a small group of men deciding which books got in and which didn't. The Book of Enoch didn't get in. What it contains is a first-person account attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, describing a vision in which he's shown the structure of heaven, the mechanics of the calendar, the fate of the dead, and a catastrophic event that preceded the flood. An event caused not by human wickedness alone, but by something coming down from above. The text calls them the Watchers, 200 beings, led by a figure named Shemi-Haza, who descended from the heavens and landed on a mountain. The Book of Enoch names the mountain specifically, Hermon, a real place, still mapped, still visited, sitting at the northern border of modern Israel and Lebanon. The text says the Watchers swore an oath to each other on that mountain, a mutual pact to go through with something they apparently knew was forbidden. What followed was the corruption of the human world. The Watchers took human partners and taught humanity things it was not supposed to know: metalworking for weapons, the cutting of roots for medicine that could also kill, enchantments, astrology, the reading of omens. With the children born from those unions were giants, the Nephilim, who consumed everything around them until the earth cried out. And God's response, according to Enoch, was judgment, not just against humanity, against the Watchers themselves. Their sentence is the verse that matters. Chapter 10. The punishment handed down to the Watchers was binding: imprisonment beneath the earth, beneath the hills, cut off from the world they had corrupted. And the duration of that imprisonment is stated with a precision that makes the chapter feel less like mythology and more like a sealed contract. The question has always been, how long? The text gives a figure, and that figure is where 2,000 years of translation history either got it mostly right or missed something the size of an era. The team studying the Aramaic fragments knew the Ethiopic translation that most scholars work from was itself a translation of a Greek text that no longer fully exists, which was itself a translation of the original Aramaic. 3 languages, multiple transmission steps, each one a new opportunity for a single word to drift. They wanted to go back to the Aramaic, back to the earliest surviving version of the text. The cave fragments were the way in. Picture the lab where this kind of work happens. Not glamorous. Fluorescent light over a long table. High-resolution scans on a monitor. Not the original parchment, which is too fragile to handle without controlled conditions. The scans are detailed enough to see individual fibers in the material. You can zoom in until a single letter fills the screen. The problem is that even at that magnification, certain passages look like noise. The ink has migrated. The parchment has darkened unevenly. Characters that scholars assumed were one letter might be another, or two letters compressed together, or a letter with a mark above it that changes the meaning entirely. AI was fed not just these fragments, but every comparable Aramaic document that could be digitized. Dead Sea Scroll material, inscriptions, ostraca, the entire surviving body of Second Temple period Aramaic writing. The system learned to recognize not just individual characters, but scribal habits, individual letter formations, the particular way a specific scribe pressed harder on certain strokes. It took the machine days to process what would take a human a career. One analyst described what happened when the translation came back as the most ordinary-looking, extraordinary result they'd ever seen. The text hadn't changed. The verse was still there. The surrounding context was intact. But the word that the AI resolved in that critical, previously damaged passage, the word that described the duration of the Watcher's binding, was not the word that had been transmitted through the Ethiopic and Greek chains. It was a different word, a more specific one. And a few months later, a clip circulated online claiming the AI had found a verse that named the exact year the Watchers would return. It got 3 million views before anyone examined what the clip was actually claiming. Most of it was wrong, but it was wrong in a way that pointed directly at something real. Yet the Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch found at Qumran, the site near the Dead Sea, where the scrolls were discovered between 1947 and 1956, are not complete. Scholars estimate they represent roughly a quarter of the full text, but they're the oldest surviving physical evidence of the book. Some fragments date to as early as the 2nd century BCE. That's older than the earliest complete Ethiopic manuscript by well over 1,000 years. When researchers applied AI-assisted paleographic analysis, handwriting analysis trained on ancient documents, to the Cave 4 Enoch fragments specifically, they were cross-referencing against the standard translation in a way that hadn't been systematically possible before. The machine could hold the entire corpus of comparable texts in working memory simultaneously. A human working by hand compares one document to another. The AI compared one passage to 10,000 reference points at once. The passage in question is from what scholars call 1 Enoch chapter 10. This is the section where the archangel Raphael is instructed to bind the watcher Azazel under the rocks and rough ground, and Shemihaza and his companions are bound under the hills of the earth, imprisoned, the text says, until the day of judgment. The standard English translation of the duration of that imprisonment, drawn through the Ethiopic chain, renders the relevant phrase as 70 generations. That number has been in the text for as long as scholars have studied it. The AI returned a different reading. The Aramaic term it identified in the damaged section of the cave fragment was not the standard word for generation used elsewhere in the same text. It was a term used in Second Temple period writing to refer to a specific type of week, a week of years, in the tradition of Levitical calendrical writing, a unit of 7 years. The distinction matters enormously. 70 generations is vague. Scholars estimate a biblical generation anywhere from 40 to 100 years, which means 70 generations could span anywhere from 3,000 to 7,000 years, indefinite enough to make the prophecy functionally unfalsifiable. 70 weeks of years is something different. In the same calendar system used by Daniel, a book that shares extensive theological overlap with Enoch, a week of years is exactly 7 years. 70 of those is 490 years. Calculable, anchored, specific. The team did not publish this finding as a discovery of when the Watchers return. They published it as a translation note, a variant reading from the Aramaic that had not been previously identified due to the damaged state of the passage. It was a footnote in a technical journal, the kind of thing that circulates among a few hundred specialists. Then someone made a YouTube video about it. The room gets quieter now. The team had not anticipated this. They had found something textually interesting. The internet turned it into something else entirely. The video that spread claimed the following: that an AI had translated a hidden verse in the Book of Enoch that named the year 2027 as the year the Watchers would physically return to Earth. It cited no journal. It named no institution. It had 3 million views within 10 days and spawned hundreds of response videos across TikTok, Threads, and X. Fact checkers correctly identified it as unverified. The screenshots were fabricated. The AI output in the video wasn't from a paleographic analysis system. It was from a standard language model given a prompt that told it to interpret the text prophecy. That's not translation. That's a machine doing what you tell it to do. The specific year 2027 was not in any journal, any research paper, or any legitimate institutional publication. But here is the thing about that video and why 3 million people shared it. The people who shared it weren't all conspiracy thinkers. Were people who had read about the Dead Sea Scrolls AI work, which is real. People who had seen coverage of the Vesuvius Challenge, where a machine learning system successfully decoded, burned ancient scrolls from Herculaneum that no human had been able to read, which is also real. People who understood that AI was genuinely changing what was legible from the ancient world. They were primed by real developments to find the claim plausible. What they were responding to, beneath the fabricated screenshots and the invented year, was a legitimate question. If the term in that Aramaic fragment really is a week of years, rather than a generation, what does the arithmetic of the surrounding text actually suggest? That question has a real answer, and the real answer is in some ways more uncomfortable than the fabricated one. Yet the Book of Enoch contains not one but 2 calendrical prophecy structures. The first is the one in chapter 10, the binding of the Watchers. The second is what scholars call the Apocalypse of Weeks, a section spanning chapters 93 and 91 that divides all of human history, from Enoch's time to the final judgment, into 10 weeks. This structure is real and extensively studied. The consensus among specialists is that the author was using it to map prophetic events onto a calendrical framework familiar to Second Temple Judaism, are not literal 7-day periods. They are ages, eras. The author maps the flood, the giving of the law, the building of the temple, the Babylonian exile, all events the original audience would have recognized, onto specific weeks of the sequence. And if you accept the internal framework of the text and work backward from the events that the author treats as already completed, the flood, Mount Sinai, the temple, the implied starting point of the calendar is roughly Enoch's own era, approximately 5,000 years before the current period. Working forward from there, the framework places the 10th and final week, the week of judgment, in what the text calls the 7th part of the 10th week. Some researchers who have done this arithmetic seriously, not speculatively but mathematically, arrive at a range rather than a year. That range clusters around the current century, not 2027, not any specific year. One translator who has spent years on the Aramaic fragments and who has spoken to journalists about the AI analysis without naming the specific journal or institution, described the experience of running that arithmetic as the kind of thing you do once, get a cold feeling about, and then go back to doing your actual work. Not because it was conclusive, because it was close enough to be uncomfortable without being close enough to be definitive. That distinction, uncomfortable but not definitive, is exactly where most serious Enoch scholarship lives. And it's the space the viral video collapsed into a single fabricated year. If you're reading this as mythology, as ancient people trying to explain why the world went wrong, the Watchers are a remarkably coherent device. They externalize moral failure. They give a face to corruption. Despite being made in the image of something divine, keeps choosing destruction. But there is a school of thought, not fringe exactly, but definitely not mainstream, that reads the Watcher tradition as something more literal, not angels in the Sunday school sense, something else. Something that came from somewhere, changed what it found, and was removed. The scholars who work in this space, and they do exist, point to several things that are difficult to dismiss entirely. The Watcher narrative in Enoch predates the version in Genesis, which reduces it to a half-verse about sons of God and daughters of men without explanation. The Enoch version is the full account. Genesis appears to have excerpted it and moved on. The Book of Giants, Yet a related text also found at Qumran, and also among the Dead Sea Scroll material, expands the narrative further, describing the Nephilim's dreams of destruction before the flood, and an entity that interprets those dreams. That text is fragmentary, but it suggests the Watcher tradition was not one book by one author. It was a body of literature, a sustained cosmological framework that a significant portion of Second Temple Judaism considered important enough to preserve, copy, and study. And then something happened. Over the course of the first several centuries of the Common Era, that entire framework was gradually removed from the mainstream record. The books were excluded. The theology was reframed. The Watchers in official religious tradition became either allegory or footnote. The question of why, who decided this, when, yet and with what authority, has no clean answer. What we do know is that the communities at Qumran were copying Enoch manuscripts at the same time that other groups were beginning the process that would lead to the canonical Bible. They thought this text was important enough to preserve in multiple copies. They were right about a lot of other things. There's no comfortable place to rest in this story. Every answer opens into something larger. The team working on the translation knew that. They published a technical note about a single word. The world turned it into an event. That gap between what researchers found and what the public needed it to mean, that gap is its own kind of evidence. If you're finding this as compelling as I do, a like genuinely helps this channel keep pulling on threads like this one. To understand why one word in a damaged cave fragment can do this kind of damage to a 2,000-year-old translation consensus, you need to understand how transmission works. The Book of Enoch's journey, from its original composition to any version you can read today, ran through at least 3 language transitions and uncounted scribal copies. Original Aramaic, Greek translation, now partially lost. Ethiopic translation from the Greek, surviving in manuscripts from the 15th century onward. Every hand that copied it was working from the copy before it, not from the original. Every translator was working with the vocabulary of their own time. The Aramaic word that the AI identified in the Cave 4 fragment, the one that changes generation to week of years in chapter 10, is a term that appears in the Book of Daniel in exactly the same technical sense. Daniel's famous 70 weeks prophecy uses the same construction. Scholars have spent enormous energy interpreting that prophecy. The Enoch parallel, if the AI's reading holds up to peer scrutiny, suggests the two texts were drawing from a shared calendrical tradition. That shared tradition would mean Enoch's prophecy about the duration of the Watcher's imprisonment was not vague poetry. It was a calculation, built on the same system as Daniel's timeline, meant to be resolved, not spiritualized. Here, the caveat, and the researchers were explicit about this, is that a single damaged fragment with a single uncertain term is not a firm foundation. The AI identified the most statistically probable reading based on comparative Aramaic corpus analysis. That's significant. It's not certainty. What it is in the careful language of the research note is a variant reading that warrants serious attention in future critical editions of the Enoch text. That is not the language of prophecy, but it is the language of people who found something they weren't expecting and don't yet know what to do with it. Here's where the story stops being about philology, about ink and parchment and scribal decisions, and starts being about what we're actually asking when we study a text like this. The Book of Enoch was not written to be ignored. It was written to be acted on, to make its readers feel the weight of a specific cosmological situation, that the world had been corrupted by entities that were supposed to remain above it, that those entities had been removed but not destroyed, and that their removal was not permanent. The binding had a duration. The imprisonment would end. Whether you read that as theology, mythology, or something else entirely, the text is making a claim about time, about a sequence with a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an approaching conclusion. Some researchers who work at the intersection of ancient cosmology and contemporary religious scholarship have noted something that is verifiable and worth sitting with. The tradition of watching for the Watcher's return is not a modern invention. It is built into the text. Isaiah, the Book of Enoch, instructs Enoch to write his visions down specifically for a future generation, not his own children, not his contemporaries, but people who would come later. Not for this generation, but for a remote one that will come. That line is in chapter 1. If we follow follow the arithmetic implied by the variant reading, the weeks of years interpretation, and we accept the framework's internal starting point as genuine. The range it produces for the end of the Watcher's imprisonment is not ancient history. It is not the medieval period. It falls within the era we are currently living through, possibly within the lifetimes of people watching this. That is speculation. Stated honestly, it's speculation built on a contested variant reading of a damaged fragment of a non-canonical text. There are simpler explanations. The AI's reading could be wrong. The comparative analysis could be overfit to the Daniel tradition in a way that reflects the machine's training data rather than the original author's intent. The framework itself might be literary rather than prophetic, a way of organizing narrative rather than predicting events. Of course, there are simpler explanations. There always are. But there's a reason the community at Qumran was making copies of this text. Multiple copies. Careful copies. The same people who also copied the Book of Daniel. The same people who appear to have believed they were living in the final stages of the framework they were preserving. They might have been wrong about the timing. They were not obviously wrong about the framework. And now, 2,000 years later, a machine trained on the collective body of their writing has returned a reading that makes the framework more specific, not less. Not a comfortable vagueness stretched across millennia. A calculation with a range. The question is whether that range is coincidence, or whether someone left it there deliberately, in a word they knew would be blurred, in a text they knew would be buried, waiting for something that could finally read it. The fragment itself is not in a cave anymore. It's in a climate-controlled archive behind glass, maintained at a specific temperature and humidity level. Scholars must apply months in advance to view it in person. Most who study it now never see the original, only the high-resolution scan. The physical object is preserved with the kind of care reserved for things that are genuinely irreplaceable, which it is. A fragment of parchment no larger than the palm of your hand, edges brown and brittle. The writing on it so small and compressed that you need magnification just to confirm its writing. It was produced by a human being, someone who sat down with a reed pen and an ink pot and carefully reproduced a text they considered sacred. We don't know their name. We don't know if they understood everything they were copying or if, like most scribes, they were transmitting faithfully without fully comprehending. We don't know if they knew that particular fragment would survive. They hid it well enough that it did. There's something worth sitting with in that. Whoever wrote this, whoever first heard Enoch's vision and thought it needed to be preserved, was living in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to the tradition they were protecting. The texts were being marginalized. The theological framework they described was being excluded, and yet someone kept making copies, kept hiding them in caves, kept refusing to let the words disappear. The word that the AI identified, the one that makes the prophecy specific rather than vague, was in a passage that survived only because it was hidden. Everything around it was lost. The Greek intermediary text is gone. The other Aramaic copies of that particular chapter are all more damaged. That one fragment from one cave in one particular condition, it is the only place the Aramaic original of chapter 10 survived, with that specific word still legible enough for a machine to resolve. That is either extraordinary luck, or it is exactly what it looks like, a preservation that outlasted everything designed to end it. The team that conducted the AI analysis did not make any prophetic claims in their publication. They noted the variant reading. They called for further study. They flagged it as significant without claiming they knew what it signified. That is what careful scholarship looks like. It is also, if you read between the lines, what it looks like when people find something they're not fully prepared for. The original research note was published quietly, no press release, no media outreach. The kind of thing that circulates among specialists. Then someone found it, made a video. They got the details wrong but got the emotional weight right. Because the emotional weight was always there, sitting in that single word on that one fragment, waiting for something capable of reading it clearly. We now have something capable of reading it clearly. What we don't have yet is the courage to sit with what it says. So here is the question the translation leaves open. The variant reading is real. The arithmetic it implies is real. The framework it connects to, the Danielic calendar of weeks, the apocalypse of weeks in Enoch itself, is real and extensively documented. What we don't know is whether the person who originally wrote weeks of years in that passage was making a calculated prophecy with a specific endpoint in mind, or whether they were making a theological statement about divine patience while using the language of calculation without intending it to be calculated. Two ways to read the same word, two completely different implications. Was the author of the Watcher judgment in chapter 10 a prophetic writer who embedded a specific timeline into the punishment, one that a damaged text and a 2,000-year gap conspired to hide, only for a machine to finally surface it in the era it describes? Or was the word always there, correctly transmitted in traditions we trusted less, pointing to a duration that was always meant to feel unresolvable, and the AI found exactly what was there, no more, no less? One of those answers is deeply uncomfortable for religious traditions that excluded this text. The other is deeply uncomfortable for the people who spent 3 million views on a fabricated year. If this changed how you see what's been sitting in those caves above the Dead Sea, share it with someone who needs to sit with it too. The fragment is still in its archive, still behind glass, still the temperature it needs to be to survive another 1,000 years. The word is still there, and whatever it means, the text was always going to be read eventually.